your men can have love for the truckie. Beautiful minds, but we love getting ugly. Risk takers with a clover, man, we love getting lucky. You run, we chase fire, I love when it ducks me. Tones go off, house watch, read the address out. 1075, get up off the magic couch. 500 gallons prepared for the baddest drought. Who else you want on the way when disaster's out? Can't even get a little bit rattled when you enter with exit apparel. Mayday, member down, they'll drag you. You won't get this from every Tom, Dick, and Harold, but here's a view from the top floor with Mickey Farrell.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of A View from the Top Floor. Today's episode is a special one for me. Ryan Michler, founder of Order of Man, father, combat vet, author of The Masculine Manifesto, as well as Sovereignty, a man on a mission bringing masculinity back to society. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. No further ado, Ryan Michler, Order of Man.
Where did it all begin? You're from Utah, Army National Guard in high school. I want to talk about that a little bit. You started right in high school with the Army National Guard, so that was like your extracurricular activity was going into the Army, right?
Yeah, well, most of my high school, my extracurricular activities were, chasing around girls and playing sports. I wrestled, I played football, I played baseball, and then my senior year, I joined the National Guard. So when I graduated from high school, I think I was hanging out for 2 or 3 months, getting ready to ship off to basic training, which was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So I think I left for Fort Sill, like I said, 2-3 months after I graduated high school, and then spent 8 years, including an active duty combat tour in Iraq in 2005, and then got out around 2006, 2007.
I was going through one of your things on your website. Something that really struck a nerve with me was, I'm just going to read it right off your website here. It said, I saw an oppressed people fighting for their lives in the face of fear, trinity, and destruction. I saw grown men weeping because they just lost one of their brothers in arms. I saw men literally giving everything they had, the ultimate sacrifice, for a cause they believed in. I've had people question my honor for serving this great nation. I've cried with soldiers who lost their families while they were away. And I can tell you that if I had a chance to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. That's powerful. And yeah. I think that right there, to me, is what we're losing, not only maybe just in our military, but in the fire service, but in society, is that understanding of it's okay to weep with your brothers, and it's okay to be masculine, but have emotion. That's a great example. How do you feel about that, though? I mean, living that moment and then creating Order of Man, like, it kind of coincides all together, right?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate to express emotion when it's appropriate. And we as men need to determine when that is. If you're in the middle of responding to a fire, breaking down into emotional outbursts, whether they're warranted or not, is probably not an appropriate time to let go of your emotions. But if you lose a brother or a sister, or have a particularly rough situation that you and your crew are dealing with, then yeah, in the appropriate time, I think it's really important to be able to express those emotions, to feel those emotions, and then to learn and understand from them. A lot of people think that emotions are bad, at least some of them. Anger, sadness, sorrow, grief, jealousy, resentment, etc. There are no negative emotions. They're simply indicators to us that there's something going on that we need to be aware of. And every emotional response that we feel to a set of circumstances is there to serve us in some way. And unless we're willing to acknowledge how we feel, we'll never be able to use those quote unquote so-called negative emotions for positive outcomes. Sadness, for example, can lead to sadness in the fire service or in the military can lead to being better trained and better equipped so that it doesn't happen again. So there's a lot of good that can come from those, again, negative emotions, if you want to call them that, if you're willing to look at how they're there to serve you.
Now, is that ultimately, like a moment like that, your early stages of manhood, is that where Order of Man came from? So I know, you speak about your past and the way you were raised and that lack of masculinity maybe in that younger stage of your life. Going into the military, you're finding that brotherhood, that tribe, if you will, and then you ultimately came into Order of Man a few years ago. Is that moments like that, as that led up to Order of Man, but what actually developed Order of Man for you?
Yeah, obviously a lot of my childhood, not obviously, but a lot of my childhood was spent without a permanent father figure in my life. I had stepfathers come into my life, and I had great coaches that were mentoring me and training and coaching me. So I did have good examples. Just wasn't in my home. And so I really floundered, especially when in the early stages of my marriage and fatherhood, I really floundered with what a good man was supposed to do. And it also continues to this day to rear its ugly head if I'm not vigilant about what I need to be doing to serve the people that I love. I was doing some financial planning when I got back from Iraq, and I spent about 8 or 9 years doing that and had built up a very successful financial planning firm. And I started podcasting. I started a podcast in 2014, maybe 2015, somewhere right in there. And it was called Wealth Anatomy. And it was geared towards helping my clients, who were mainly doctors, deal with their financial stuff. And I realized very, very quickly, I love the medium of podcasting, but I didn't want to continue to have that financial conversation. And I had talked with a lot of guys in my circle about things that I was dealing with marital struggles and not having a father figure in my life and the challenges of fatherhood. And every man I talked to had the same issue. And I realized we all have the same struggles, but nobody's talking about it. And there was a couple of websites. One was Art of Manliness with Brett McKay and a few others that were doing some good work. But I realized that there was a gap between the information that we as men know and have and what we're actually willing to do with that information. So I did about 20 or so episodes with the Wealth Anatomy podcast. And then I pivoted very quickly into creating Order of Man in 2015, which stemmed from me just wanting to have conversations with men, whether they were scholars or athletes or warriors or New York Times bestselling authors or astronauts. And those guys had inspired me. And so I launched Order of Man, and it took off immediately, which is a testament to men want information. They want to be able to apply it in their lives. They were struggling, and they still are. Maybe even more so today than they were in 2015 when I started this.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I think we're struggling more than ever. I mean, I found you probably around 2015, 16, right when you were starting. You know, I've been a pretty passionate follower of yours for all these years. I love the podcast, and I've gotten so much out of it. I love the Friday Field Notes. There's so much value in that quick, short bursts of just getting into your weekend and being ultimately a better person. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head with that. But I think what we're losing now in society, especially at least what I see in the fire service, and maybe looking back kind of with your military brothers, if you still interact with them, is that we're losing that tribe mindset, you know. And with the tribe, we sense a masculinity, right? So that's what the fire service, the firehouse, our company, it's a tribe-like environment. And military, the same thing. Sporting, same thing, that tribe mindset. And I think with the generation of the children we're raising today, these young men in the video game culture, not playing sports, not being outside, interacting, getting in fist fights, getting punched in the face and being humbled, we don't gain that humility. And I'm really seeing that so much in today's fire service, is that we don't have that sense of humility.
Yeah, I think for the most part, when men graduate high school, they lose a lot of that brotherhood and camaraderie. You know, a lot of guys are playing sports or part of a club or a team of some sorts, whether it's physical in nature or political, maybe even nature, or, you know, Future Farmers of America, an organization like that. But regardless of what it is, these boys are working in tribes and groups the way they're supposed to. And barring military service or, you know, fire department, I think police officers probably have something that's similar in a lot of ways to what the fire department would have. And maybe even some college sports. Men largely lose their band of brothers when they graduate high school, and then they're isolated. And they isolate themselves. I mean, this is not just society's problem. It's our problem as individuals that we need to be aware of. And so, you know, a lot of guys that we talk with are basically lone wolves, and they have been for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And now we're telling them, hey, part of the problem you're dealing with is you don't have other men in your corner. You don't have guys to hold yourself accountable to. You don't have guys you can hold accountable. You don't have men you can learn from. You don't have any physical competition. All of these elements are so crucial. And barring sports or military service or, you know, fire service, something like this, men just don't have it, and they need it. And I think that's a large part of why we're struggling. It's not that we, a lot of people will say, well, we're struggling because men don't share. Men don't have anybody to share with. You know, you can't talk with your wife about some of these things. Like, you can talk with them, but they'll never fully understand what you're going through because they're not men. And that's not a knock on women by any means. It just means they don't know. And so you have to find other guys who are going through similar struggles, whether it's divorce and separation or substance abuse or fatherhood issues. You have to find guys who are doing that as well or have overcome it, and learn from them, band with them, connect with them.
How do you feel that your past failures has shaped your challenges in life. And when do you know that that failure in the moment is time to learn or it's time to reflect?
I don't know that you have to separate those two, actually. Time to learn or time to reflect. I mean, learning is a byproduct of reflection. You can't learn something unless you're reflecting on what it is to be learned. So when do you start reflecting? Immediately. I mean, that's as soon as you possibly can. Guys wait so long a lot of the times because their ego gets in the way. You know, they fail and they think to themselves, you know, it couldn't possibly be me. It was a breakdown in communication with her or, you know, society or the economy or the president or fill in the blank with your excuse of choice. But I try to, and I'm not an expert at this by any means, and I don't get this 100% right, but when I fail, whether it's a product flop or fail in my relationship, and I've struggled with substance abuse personally, I try to reflect as soon as I possibly can because I don't want to continue to wallow in that failure. And a lot of men do. It's almost like they almost get something out of it, whether it's attention or the excuse of not performing as well as they know they should. If you're wallowing in your own self-pity and your failures, there's something you're getting from it. And the sooner you can realize what you are getting, at least you're perceiving to receive from being that way, the sooner you can let go of that and let go of the excuses and start reflecting, as you said, and learning what you need to do to make your life better moving forward.
I think that ego is the biggest blocker in progression, especially
of course
in my world. It's like majority of us type A personalities, and when you were in the military, type A personality, and when you make a mistake, we're so quick to dismiss it and not reflect on it. We're not necessarily learning from it. We're just dismissing it because there's a sense of embarrassment where we're not supposed to make the mistakes. You know, we're supposed to be at a certain level of high performance. And I think that finding that humility is the ultimate success in anything we do. But we have to find that humility and then share it. I think sharing is the main objective of success. When we block that ego, we make the mistake, reflect, we learn, but then sharing it ultimately, that's the main thing. And like you said, none of us all, we don't have that tribe mentality or that tribe environment where we can share our mistakes. So what you've developed with Order Man and the Iron Council, and we'll talk about that, it's what a great network for people who don't necessarily have the fire service, the police department, the military. Like you said, and this is a great way to approach it, is that when your circle of friends, more so probably in the accounting world or corporate America, they don't have that tribe-like mentality or that tribe-like atmosphere of involvement with other men. And I think that when we transform, people change all the time, and they're leaving corporate America and they're coming to the fire service. We see it all the time, and I see very quickly, like, this whole tribe mentality, they just don't understand it, and it's not necessarily for everyone. And I think that's a problem we're struggling with in the fire service as well.
Well, I think it's probably intimidating for a guy that's never been banded with other men because now he's held to a standard where previously there was no standard. The guy could get up, do what he wants, act how he wants, show up how he wants. Whether he performs or not doesn't really matter. There's no real consequence to it. But all of a sudden you get into the fire service or police department or in the military and you're held to a standard. And that standard is there because it's literally a life and death situation. And that's going to be intimidating for a lot of men who have never been in that situation. But I do want to say something about the ego because we tend to say something similar to what you said, or at least embrace the idea that a type A personality and humility don't go together. And I don't know why we believe that. Maybe it's because we see these machismo type guys lacking humility, but I would suggest that a type A personality, which in a lot of ways is synonymous with a leader, the best leaders you've ever had are the most humble. And here's the ironic thing about it. Let's say you make a mistake on a call or in training or something. And rather than shift the blame or pretend it doesn't exist or suggest that you didn't create the problem, what if instead you said, hey guys, you know, that was on me. I messed up. I screwed up. Here's what I did wrong. Let's run through that again so I can get that figured out. And here's what I'm going to do differently. A man who says that, ironically, does not undermine his influence with other people. He might think, if he's never done this before, that it will undermine the influence. It doesn't. It actually bolsters his influence. So a subordinate, or maybe somebody underneath that leader who hears a leader actually acknowledge what he did wrong and how he's going to improve, and then watches him do it, makes him so much more influential in the eyes of that subordinate than not acknowledging the mistake at all. Because guess what? Everybody knows you're messing up. And just because you don't say it doesn't mean people don't see it. They see it. So you might as well acknowledge it, fix it, and then bolster your influence and success with the people you're trying to serve.
I had Jason Redman on the show, and we were talking about just that with being a leader and finding that humility in it. And he said that if he probably accepted it quicker and then owned it with his men, they probably would have looked at him a little bit differently. And his journey would have been probably laid out a little bit differently than the way it did lay out. It laid out ultimately in the end for the positive, but it took a little bit more to gain that respect back, and he did own it right away. And obviously, Jason, a great leader, a patriot, just the humility sense of the fact that he told me that on the podcast made me realize, like, you know, he really did own that and reflected on it. But the main thing is, in the moment, you have to own it. And that's what I take as a leader when I lead my men, is that every little thing I do wrong, I start the conversation when we reflect after our mission or after we put the fire out, is that, you know what, I did this, I probably should have done that. And that opens the floodgates for these guys to share their screw-ups with me. You know, we all do a lot of good things when we go out these fires, but there's so many micro bad things that if we don't identify and learn from the micro, we lose on the back end, and they become macro incidents within the incident. And that's ultimately where firemen die, and we can't do our job. But let's talk about masculinity, because I feel like the politicians, the civilians, they're pulling this away from not only the fire service, but just society in general. It's not that being a man is a bad thing, but we're being dismissed in our roles. And I feel that masculinity is so important for progression of anything we do. How do you define masculinity, though, in like today's cultural landscape? What's your core principles and foundation of it?
Well, sometimes I use masculinity and manliness synonymously, but in a discussion like this, I want to make a distinction. Masculinity, if you look at the definition of what it is, it's simply a set of behaviors and characteristics that we as men possess due to our biological makeup. It's nothing more than that. In this context, when I talk about the distinction, it's really amoral. It's neither good nor bad. You usually have one side of the equation that says masculinity is inherently good, and you have the other side of the equation that says masculinity is inherently bad. I don't think it's either. I think it's really just a matter of how you harness and wield that masculinity. Take a propensity for violence, for example. You know, if you're walking down the street and you see a man who brutally assaults a woman, physically or sexually, I think we could all agree that men have a propensity for violence and even sexual. I think we could all agree that that is a improper use of the masculine propensity for violence. But let me paint a different scenario. You see a man walking down the street and he assaults a woman, and you decide that you're going to step up and violently attack him and administer justice to that individual. I think any rational person would agree that that is a proper and effective use of our masculine propensity for violence. So it's not the violence or the competition or the stoicism or the physicality. It has nothing to do with that. What distinguishes masculinity from manliness is a man's ability to harness his masculinity for effective and productive outcomes for himself and the people around him. I have 3 sons. I also have a daughter, but I'm just going to talk about my sons for a minute. Nobody calls them men. They're not even expected to be. I have a 16-year-old son, a 13-year-old son, and an 8-year-old son. They're boys. My 16-year-old, maybe you could consider a young man, but for the most part, they're boys. And so my 8-year-old, when he doesn't get what he wants, he'll bite you or he'll yell or he'll throw a little temper tantrum, and we expect that. But what makes a man is when he harnesses it, again, for productive outcomes. So when you start to use competition for good, or you start to regulate your emotions in order to serve other people, or you take your propensity for violence or physicality and harness it into protecting other people and serving other people, that's when we would say he's a man or he's manly, right? Everybody says that. Oh, that's a man's man, or he's manly, or that's manliness right there. That's positive, and that's the distinction between masculinity and manliness.
I like that. We have a term in the fire service. It's called "you're a fireman's fireman," and that means that you have that leadership, that manliness about you, right? And how you're just a natural born leader, and your morals are correct in what you believe in. But how do you build the confidence to get there, to gain that masculinity or that manliness? Where does that confidence come from?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to embrace your masculinity. And that's one thing, to your point earlier, that society is actually rejecting. You know, you look at young men, for example, in the school system. They're told to sit down, to shut up, to color within the lines. They have a zero tolerance policy on fighting, which is ridiculous. If a young boy, if one of my sons sees a kid getting picked on by a bully or somebody who's a higher grade than him, he better stand up for that kid. And if he does, he's going to get kicked out of school just as easily as the bully who was doing wrong to that child. That's ridiculous. There's nuance to the situation. None of my sons would ever get in trouble at home for sticking up for somebody, even if violently. But at school, there's repercussions. Why? Because we don't understand the nuance and the differences between boys and girls. So even at the school level, from the time they're 5 to 18, they're told to sit down, to shut up, to color within the lines, not to fight, not to act out, not to be physical, not to compete. And we're stripping that away from our young men. So to your point about how do you build the confidence, I think is what you said. First thing, you have to embrace the fact that you're a man, that there's nothing wrong with having a propensity towards physicality or violence, that there's nothing wrong with being competitive or being stoic or having aggression. I think about in the fire service, these people who complain about masculinity and it's toxic and, you have it's a meme now, but it's the bear versus man. Would a woman rather run into a bear or a man in the woods, and everybody picks the bear? You know what? When they're not complaining, when their house is on fire and you guys show up in your truck and you beat down or break down that door and you extinguish that fire at your own personal risk, nobody in that situation says, that was toxic. I think if most guys look at me or guys like you or other people maybe they have some sort of interaction with and they think, oh, that guy's got it. Like it's the X factor. The way he walks, his demeanor, the way he carries himself, the way he looks, the things that he says, how he communicates and articulates his words and thoughts and ideas, and they think that guy's he's just got it. And if I was more confident, then I would have it too. The reason that guy has it is because of what you just said. He's being courageous. What courageousness does is it fosters and it helps build competency. So you have courage, then you have competency through your courageous actions. And as you build a competency in your given field or your work or even hobbies, when you have that competency, that's when you begin to feel confident. You don't get to have the confidence without the courage and the competency. And anybody who seems like they do or may think they do, it's probably just ego, arrogance, false bravado, pride, and it's not healthy, and they'll be found out. It's actually an indicator of insecurity, not courageousness.
And I'm scared for the future of not only what I believe in the fire service. I'm really scared for the future of the country from the military standpoint and where we're going. And I don't want to get into politics, but you could see it from our leaders from the top all the way down to the small municipalities and the way they're run. We're losing that leadership role, and I think it comes from people being scared to take that chance and step into the role.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You were talking about leadership, and I've often referred to it as leading before the title. You don't have to have a title. You don't have to be a lieutenant, or I don't know the rank structure within the fire department, but you don't have to be a captain or a lieutenant or whatever that is in order to be the leader. You should be leading now with where you currently are. But you're right, and we don't need to get political, but I would suggest that more men get political, that we get elected, and that we serve in the city council, or we serve as mayors of our towns, or we serve as representatives of our state, or that we work ourselves into federal positions, because it is clear to me, abundantly clear on both sides of the aisle, that we are void of true manliness. Men who are bold and courageous, and here's another one, hold people accountable. I mean, the federal government and a lot of municipalities, to your point earlier, believe that it's their role to rescue people from their own choices. And I don't see that anywhere in the Constitution. That's not their role. And yet they've stepped into that role because so many people are weak and cowardly and have never learned to make their own decisions and live by the results of their own effort. And we need politicians who acknowledge what their actual role is and let people feel the weight of their decisions. That's not fun, that's not enjoyable, and it will present a lot of hardship, but it's the hardship that helps you realize I need to do something different. If you're miserable or you're broke or you're unhealthy, that's when men start to change. A lot of times men will ask, or people will ask me when men come into my organization, why and when do they come in? It's when they're suffering. It's when they're going through a divorce, or they have a medical complication, or they're financially broke, or they just lost a job, or they have a loss of a loved one. It's in moments of hardship that they start looking for a better way to do it. And if we rob people of the consequences of their choices, they will never get better, and they'll always be dependent on Big Daddy government, which is kind of the idea, right? So we need to leave people alone and let them make their own choices in a level playing field so that everybody can grow, and they'll all grow at different rates, but everybody will grow and expand and get better because they don't want to experience the negative consequences of poor choices.
I spoke with Jay Collins, retired Green Beret, and in our conversation, he didn't seem like the politician type, but he's very passionate about the political side of not only our nation, but his local government within Florida. And I asked him, I go, what brought you to that? And more or less, he said, if it's not me, then who? Because we need to do a change. He's not into politics for himself. And that's the fine line between what we have to understand where we look at the leadership in any role. To have a leader on a government side, when they're doing it for personal reasons, then we're in trouble. But when you have a guy who's a combat vet, a career military man, retired from the military and says, you know what, things are not good. Let me take that role, step into that role for the greater good of the people, for the nation, a true patriot. That's what we need. We need men to step into that role that want to make a difference, not for a personal gain, but for the ultimate better good of the nation.
I agree. I mean, you asked me earlier what makes a man, and I think it's on the hat that you're wearing right now, and it's over my right shoulder. Our motto is to protect, provide, and preside. And all three of those have, at their core, the foundation of all three of those attributes is service. We are meant to serve. We're meant to lead. We're meant to protect people. We're meant to provide for people. And when we start making ourselves capable of stepping into those roles, not only are we more fulfilled with ourselves and our progress and pursuits, but we are able to help other people get to a path that they could not have imagined being on themselves.
So you created Order of Man, and that's the platform. But let's talk about the Iron Council now. Just elaborate on what the Iron Council is for listeners to understand what that means to you and what it means for the people that are a part of the Iron Council.
Yeah, the Iron Council is, I call it an exclusive brotherhood. You know, we're everywhere on social media, and we've got, I don't know, probably 1 million followers in all of our different social media accounts. And some conversations are good and some aren't, but there's so much out there that I really felt like we needed a place where we could take all of that information that's available, break it down into digestible, usable information. And really what I think the Iron Council does is it helps bridge the gap between what we know and what we do. Because just if you listen to the podcast, I've had 508 guests on at this point. We've done over 1,500 episodes of the podcast. And all of that information is there. And it's great information. But unless you actually use it, what good is it? So the Iron Council is a place where we say, okay, well, here's the information. Now, how do we consume it and package it in a way that we actually can go out and do work? And then in addition to that, all the men in there are holding each other accountable. We're working towards similar goals. We're having focused conversations, whether it's overcoming a divorce or defeating substance abuse or learning how to shoot firearms or self-defense or manage your money or build a business. We're having very focused conversations in each one of those topics and a whole lot more. I've really found that the tens of thousands now of people who have gone through this program, if they do it correctly and they commit to it, they're rebuilding relationships. They're connecting with their kids in the way they haven't before. They're finally starting that business they've been thinking about for 10 years. They're getting out of debt. They're putting money away. They're going on vacations and learning how to retire effectively. It is pretty amazing when you see a guy who comes in because he's potentially going through a divorce, and over the course of 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, he now reaches out and says, hey, Ryan, you know, I was on the verge of divorce, but with the help of your programs and the help of the other guys in the Iron Council, my wife and I were in therapy. We're doing really well. We've made some big moves. We paid off debt. We're more intimate and connected than we've ever been. It's really, really rewarding when you see guys who are in the throes of defeat pull themselves out of it through some efforts of their own and some information of ours.
Now, I know you have retreats. Is this all part of the Iron Council, or are they separate? So you join the Iron Council. Is that an invitation to come to one of your retreats, or is that two separate?
They're two separate. Most of our events and retreats are open to the public, you know, whether it's we do one called Uprising. That's usually about 25 to 30 men. We spend about 3.5 days together. We do another one called Legacy, which is a father-son event. We've got one coming up in May of 2025 called The Forge, a Gathering of Men. We'll have over 200 guys there, And I'm partnering with some other organizations that work with men to bring that online, or offline, I guess you should say, since it's a experience. It's an offline experience. So yeah, those are open. We do have a lot of Iron Council members that attend those events, of course, but it is open to anyone, whether you're in the Iron Council or not.
These events, are they scattered throughout the country? Because I know you were based in Maine, then back to Utah, but these events, are they nationwide, or are you just have like a home base?
Yeah, typically for most of our events, it's a home base. It's here in southern Utah. It was in Maine, but I moved back a couple of years ago. That Forge Gathering of Men event that we're doing, that one's in St. Louis. So we are going to try to spread out a little bit more. And then inside the Iron Council, we have regional chapters. So there might be a big region in Southwest Texas, or in New Jersey or New York or Michigan. So these guys are getting together and meeting locally, regionally, and doing events. We had a bunch of guys. I think there was probably 30 guys meet up a couple of weeks ago, and they did what they call the Pantheon Games, which is a term they came up with themselves, and they all go and they compete against each other and just have a really great weekend. I've seen videos and everything, stuff like that they're doing on their own outside of what we create and provide. They're starting to do on themselves, which is really cool.
Wow, that's great. You're doing good work, man. Really.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We're trying.
So what advice would you give to someone struggling with embracing humility, particularly when they feel the pressure to assert themselves and prove their worth?
That's a good question. That's an interesting question. How can you embrace your humility? Well, what I would say first and foremost is learn to acknowledge your own deficiencies without projecting or sharing them, because that's really the scary part. The scary part is to share it with somebody, because you don't want to be found out as a fraud. So if I was learning to be more humble, you guys probably do something like an after action review. I imagine a process like that after exercises or fires. Is that right?
Yeah, after every fire, doesn't matter if it's 2 a.m, we come back to the kitchen, quickly go over what we did, and like I said, I start with the mistakes usually, and that kind of opens the door, the floodgates for everyone admitting their mistakes. And then ultimately, I think we can progressively move as a company and a department more positive light by admitting the mistakes. But that's where it starts, is like right away, and then we'll get into the tactical side of things the next day usually.
What do you call that? Is it an after action review, or what do you call that process?
I mean, hot wash, people call it.
Hot wash, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really a term I use. We just kind of, we'll get together and you just have a cup of coffee and you sit in the kitchen. We don't really have a name for it, but.
Yeah. Well, what I would suggest, since the large part of your audience are firefighters, is whatever that process is for you and your department or your company, do that for yourself. And so I would get out a journal. I've got mine right here. So I'd get out a journal, and every day at the end of the day, I would write down the things that went well, the things that didn't go well, the things that you wanted to accomplish, the things that you did not accomplish that you wanted to. And then most importantly, what are you going to do tomorrow that you didn't do today? Maybe it's a certain task you needed to accomplish, or maybe you didn't show up powerfully for somebody when you needed to. Maybe you were impatient when you should have been a little bit more graceful. Maybe you were arrogant when you could have been a little bit more humble. But the more that you start to document this and prove that there are some deficiencies in your life, the more I think you're naturally going to start shoring them up. So that's what I would do on a personal level if you're working to build your humility, is actually admit to yourself that there are deficiencies and write down what they are. In addition to that, you need to start expressing this to other people. And the best thing that you can do is start to build a powerful brotherhood with other men. And that means having real conversations, asking people, what are you scared of? What keeps you up at night? What are you working on? What have been your biggest failures? What would you have done differently in these situations? The more questions you can ask like that, and you'll start to realize and see very quickly who's interested in those conversations and who are not. And the people who are not, that's fine. It's their prerogative. But you start doubling down on building relationships with the people who are willing to have those types of conversations. And as you build that trust, and it will be a trust exercise, because they're sharing information that's not real comfortable to always share. As you build trust and you start to share that information, they'll have trust in you, and you'll start to see how easy it really is when you exercise humility and you admit to not only yourself, but to other people that you don't have it all figured out. So do it for yourself, then do it for a select group of people, and then you can start building up the courage from there to share with a wider audience, whether it's your entire department or maybe you have an opportunity to do some public speaking. But I'll tell you what, this is the thing that I've learned probably the most out of doing this work for about 10 years now. The best connections I've ever made with people And in order to influence people, you need to be connected with them. If you don't have a connection, you cannot influence them. But the best connections I've ever made come from the times that I've been the most honest about my own shortcomings. It's not me standing up here on some pulpit and lecturing people about how wonderful I am and why they need to be wonderful too. It's about all of us sitting together and me talking about not only the things that have gone well, but the real failures that I've had in my life and what I'm actively doing to clean those up. When I start talking with men about that, to your point earlier, it gives them permission to do the same thing, and it forges a connection that we would never have if I was just arrogant and full of pride.
You know, Ryan, we'll end on that because there's nowhere to go from that. And that's the ultimate message of why I wanted to have you on, is what you just said there is taking ownership in who you are as an individual and then forward progressing that into a masculine side of yourself through humility. That's the ultimate game winning play in life. That's what you bring with Order of the Man, and that's what you bring with the Iron Council. And I can't thank you enough for doing the work that you've done, because you truly are making a difference, not only on a micro level, but you're at a point now where you're making such an impact on the next generation. And I want to bring this generation to my job, because it's important that what you just said, the young kids coming into the fire department, into the fire service, hear this, as well as the senior guys that are in that leadership role within the company, to know it's okay to be vulnerable in front of the young guys. And if you are vulnerable with them, the next generation will look at you with so much more respect and admiration for owning your shortcomings.
If I could say one other thing, because we talked a little bit about courage and humility, I would say this, that everybody who comes into your line of work is, I think naturally they're probably a bit more courageous just by the nature of them choosing the job. And I would imagine that as they come into the fire service, that they want to be courageous, and they're willing to be that. But what I would suggest is that you cannot be fully courageous unless humility is present. Humility is part of courage, because think about it. If it didn't require courage, if you weren't afraid or scared or some risk was there, it wouldn't require courage. So the very act of being courageous means that you're humble. It means that you're afraid. It means you know there's a risk here. So if you want to be more courageous, acknowledge the humility and acknowledge the deficiencies so that you can shore those up and become a better firefighter or a better police officer or a better military guy or a better father or a better husband. Be humble so that you can step fully into the role that you're wanting to step into.
You know, being courageous, I truly believe, comes from fear, because fear ultimately is respect. When you accept fear to a certain point, at least in my line of work, that fear element is a sense of respect, knowing that, I mean, I'm in a career of lefts and rights. You go left, you're dead. You go right, you're alive. So when you accept that fear, you ultimately are respecting the situation at hand. And then that, in the end, is making a courageous man or a courageous firefighter or a great firefighter.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. You can go to orderofman.com. We just rebuilt our website. So Josh Wellman did the website for us. He did a beautiful job. And so it's very easy to navigate. And you can find everything that we're doing there, from the podcast to our social media accounts to our events and also the Iron Council, like we talked about earlier.
Great. All right, if you're ever in the New York City area, we'd love to have you in the firehouse. And I'm sure many other firehouses would love to have you in and just stop in, have lunch, and break bread with the brothers and share what it means to be a true man.
I would love to do that. I'll take you up on that when I make my way there.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your time.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ryan as much as I did. Just want to let you know that moving forward, I'm no longer going to be on the National Fire Radio channel. I'm going to have my own channel, A View from the Top Floor with Mickey Farrell. I do know that all the episodes from number 1 up to episode 47 that we just did with Ryan will be on that channel, so you can find everything over there. It's not going to be a weekly show anymore. I'm going to have more content. I will have my Mondays that are locked in, but I'll do other content as well, more street talks throughout the week, and it'll be somewhat more interactive. All right, so just keep your eyes out for that. Hopefully next week or the next couple weeks, that'll be rolled out and running smoothly. Again, thanks for all the support, and I'll see you soon.